Good evening and welcome to the second Blake Society event of this new year, 2025. And we've got a treat for you tonight. Just before I introduce our speaker, a few housekeeping things. If you could keep your video and mics off until the talk is over, that will really help. And at that point, we'll invite you to turn your video on, and then there's the options in the Q&A discussion to use the raise hand function and reactions, or put your physical hand up, and we will then spotlight you and can turn your mic on and talk to us. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce tonight's talk, which is on one of the most interesting, and I think from personal experience, difficult works of Blake, and also one of his most beautiful. It's Vela, as our speaker Annise and I like to call it. Some like to call it Vala, but given that Vela has many veils, and Blake does love a pun, and sometimes she's juxtaposed with V-A-L-E-S, veils, we're going to stick with Vela tonight. And Vela is problematic for all scholars because there's no definitive version. It's a very long manuscript. It's the longest of Blake's works, never completed, never engraved or illuminated, but existing as a text, which we've seen in our introduction to the Blake talks, all of them, the British Library copy with its turning pages. And there are several erasures, there are deletions, there are there's one alternative night of the 9 nights. It's a dream in 9 nights. And so for the scholar, it can be a dream that very quickly turns into a bit of a nightmare, but its beauty is undeniable. And it very interestingly bridges Blake's earlier work and the minor prophecies with the two prophecies that follow, from which Blake quarried quite a lot of material out of Vela for the two major prophecies, Milton and Jerusalem. And so, without further ado, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our beloved colleague, our membership secretary, who quite recently was awarded her PhD for writing on Vela. And she's going to talk to us about Urizen, especially, who she loves, as do we all. And it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Dr. Annise Rogers.
Thank you, Stephen. Always a great introduction with Stephen. I'm going to now share my PowerPoint and hope that you can all see it. Please do let me know if you can't. Okay, I need to go from the beginning. Can everybody see my PowerPoint? Yep. Brilliant. I'm just going to assume that you can all see my PowerPoint as no one has answered. Okay. So the following talk is based on my PhD thesis, and therefore it's sort of the start of my thinking process, but also, as always, predominantly focused on Vela or the Four Zoas. I want to apologise to Jason and Sibylla, who have heard and read this many, many, many times already. Furthermore, some of you might recognise that part of this talk can be found in Vela, the magazine. But I hope you won't mind that I'm reusing it. So I'm going to start by explaining how I came to the idea of the Urizen cycle, and then I shall discuss what I mean by the Urizen cycle. And finally, I shall examine the four zoas, most especially night the seventh, in reference to the Urizen cycle. You're all going to be fed up with the term the Urizen cycle by the end of this talk. Okay, so whilst writing my thesis, I spent more and more time thinking about the role of Orc within Blake's mythological structure. The Orc cycle is almost synonymous with Blakean scholarship. But the more I thought about the orc, the more I realised that it was Urizen who I needed to focus on. So in this talk, I'm going to reject Northrop Frye's orc cycle and examine how it's Urizen that forms the basis for all Blake's world building. That is, in fact, the Urizen cycle, arguing that Blake's portrayal of Urizen as Satan, that is, the god of this world, the fallen world, or as the adversary, is established earlier than previously considered. This in turn suggests that Urizen's characterization is Blake's only real constant, and therefore it's the Urizen cycle. And that it was whilst Blake was writing the Four Zoas that he fully accepts that Urizen is God, the terrible destroyer, not the saviour. And it's also in this poem that Blake realizes that he wants his audience to know this too, that they haven't quite worked it out yet. So the character of Orc is diminished in Blake's later poems, a transformation that's usually interpreted as Luva taking back the role of one of the original Zoas. Leo Damrosch indicates as much when he states that Orc dwindles in significance in these later poems and is replaced by his counterpart in Eternity, Luva the Emotions. Another approach might be to see that it's not Luva that replaces Orc, but Albion. And we can do this by placing that within the context of the Urizen cycle, which I'll discuss in greater detail in a minute. Whilst the Four Zoas is the last poem in which Orc plays an important role, it's also the first poem which includes the eternal man Albion. That Albion replaces Orc is not a difficult concept to understand once we acknowledge that Blake sees Orc as a sort of Samson figure. I've previously spoken about this with Global Blake on the diminishment of Orc, so I'm just going to mention it in passing here, this transformation into a Blakean Samson figure. So instead, I'm going to focus on the role that Urizen takes in Blake's mythological structure. He is Blake's only constant, and thus I argue that it's Urizen and not Orc that is the central feature that we should talk about the Urizen cycle. To fully comprehend this, we must see that Urizen is not a representation or a representative of Satan, but as Blake himself states in Milton, Satan is Urizen, and more precisely that Urizen has always been Satan, at least for Blake. Once we remove Orc from the centre of Blake's myth, we can see he is a more complicated character than just a symbol of righteous rebellion, and that Urizen is more than simply reason. I know you already all know this. So, following the near disappearance of Orc after the Four Zoas, Blake's mythological structure is for approximately the last 2 decades of his life left without one of its central figures. So how then can Orc, a character holding a much diminished role for over 20 years, be the centre of Blake's myth? Well, the answer, of course, is that he cannot. I'm not the first to consider this point. Christopher Z. Hobson explores how this diminishment of Orc, together with no real evidence connecting the character with Urizen, a point on which I'll disagree and I'll discuss this further later, causes Frye's ideas of the Orc cycle to fall apart, and that for Hobson there is therefore no cycle at all, and that Blake scholars have been blinded, for lack of a better word, by Frye's structure. However, if we consider Urizen and not Orc as the centre of this cycle, we can examine how one of Blake's oldest characters continues to influence his work right up until his death. So, although I call this idea the Urizen cycle, it's not really a cycle at all, at least not in the way that the Orc cycle is structured. However, I decided to use cycle because I believe that people will be more receptive to this notion, especially as it's used in comparison to the Orc cycle. In more simple terms, it's the Urizen cycle for ease of understanding. Fundamentally, the Orc cycle is cyclical, while the Urizen cycle is cyclonic. In this Urizenic cyclone, Urizen takes the dominant role, but one that is nearly always disengaged. He's nearly always disengaged with, that the tempest is happening around him. As he stands as the controller of this world in the eye of the storm, he is the only place of calm, but is surrounded on all sides by utter chaos. However, this calm is both fake and deceptive, filling Urizen with a false ideal and deceiving him into thinking that he is not enclosed within a cyclone of destruction and violence. And as with the eye of the storm, when Urizen moves, so too do all the consequences of his actions and ideology. So while I've used the word cyclonic to connect to the Urizen cycle, to the Orc cycle, it's not the word Blake uses, and instead we should engage with his use of vortex or even vortexes. It's important to distance ourselves from Blake's use of storm, because within the four Zoas, the word's predominantly associated with Thamos and his seas. But we should remember to look at how Blake presents Urizen using words that might be linked with storms. So when Urizen exiles Ahania to the void in Night the Third, we see how his wrathful throne boasts forth the black hailstorm. Am I not God, said Urizen, who is equal to me? Do I not stretch the heavens abroad or fold them up like a garment? He spoke, mustering his heavy clouds around him black opaque. Then thunders rolled around and lightnings darted to and fro. Here, Urizen calls upon the elements of the storm, the black hailstorm, the heavy clouds, the thunder and lightning, to express his rage at Hania. And this shows the easy association that we can make between anger and storms. Yet, it is Urizen's connection with the vortex that seems a more solid basis for the Urizen cycle. So Urizen may be linked with storms when angry, but so too are all the other Zoas. So in Night the Sixth, Urizen appears finally to understand that his view of the world is blinkered. But instead of recognising that he himself is the reason for this, he bemoans and complains about this world, not recognising that his earlier climes of bliss were just as confined as this new world is. So Urizen's view of Orthona's dark dens is as being trapped in a world of cumbrous wheels circle, wherein he is unable to move beyond the cyclical wheels or cyclonic eye of the storm. And at first it appears that he's finally realised how the Urizen cycle can affect other characters, even explaining that when a vortex formed, weariness began on all my limbs. Urizen acknowledged that the vortex is chaotic, destructive, and energy draining. But in typical Urizenic fashion, does not recognise that this is a mirroring of his own vortex-inducing destruction. Instead, when Urizen exclaims that what a world is here unlike those climes of bliss where my sons gathered round my knee, he doesn't connect his destructive vortexes with this horrible ruin, instead uses the word unlike. He disassociates, making his struggle with Orthona's word a contrast rather than a comparison to how others see his own worldview. So in doing this, Blake reiterates the one characteristic of Urizen that makes the Urizen cycle possible, that of Urizen's complete and utter surety of his own identity. A characteristic that's missing with all the other Zoas at some point. Urizen always knows who he is, and never once is his self-identity called into question. I will point out here, it is in Night the Ninth, but I'm treating Night the Ninth as separate. There's reasons for this, but we'll leave that alone here. So when he pronounces, am I not God who is equal to me? Urizen is not asking for a response, but is self-actualizing his identity of God by demanding that no other is equal to him. This ability to completely self-identify connects very clearly to the Urizen cycle because it allows Urizen to place himself always in the centre of the cyclone, or the events occurring, making him the dominant figure even when he should not be. So, however, in the Urizen cycle, Urizen does not actually have to be directly involved for his cycle to occur. And I'll discuss this more thoroughly in my discussion of Night the 7th A and Night the 7th B later. But what's important about Night the 7th B is the character of the nameless shadowy female, who works as an agent of Urizenic power over Orc. While she's predominantly known as the shadowy female throughout Blake's mythological structure, or the fallen version of Vela, her first introduction in the Four Zoas is as the nameless shadowy vortex who stood before the face of Orc. In introducing her as a vortex, Blake is immediately making clear that she's intimately linked with Urizen and an agent of the Urizen cycle, and like Urizen himself, she believes completely in her identity as this agent, or, just as Orc knows her to be, Vela now become Urizen's harlot. In losing her identity as of Vela, and in becoming Urizen's harlot, this character is able to become a vortex. Unlike Urizen, she takes the central role here, albeit one that relies on her relationship to and her power from Urizen. Ultimately, The Urizen cycle is best recognized as a cyclonic structure in which Urizen, as the god of this world, is so sure of his own identity that he becomes the central vortex or the eye of the storm, and is therefore unable to see the destruction and chaos that he's causing to all the other characters as well as to the worlds. In the first book of Urizen, we are told that there is one command, one joy, one desire, one curse, one weight, one measure, one king, one god, one law. Perhaps this earlier rendering of Urizen's worldview can help us acknowledge that Urizen's blinkered view of the world, Blake's Urizen cycle, is when we ourselves are unable to engage with a view or ideal that is beyond or outside of our own, and a warning that a narcissistic tendency can blind us to the suffering and destruction that we might have caused. So it is S. Foster Damon who states that in the Four Zoas that Satan appeared for the first time. Sorry, S. Foster Damon, that's not completely correct. While Satan does not appear in Blake's so-called Lambeth prophecies, the Songs of Innocent Experience, or the Visions of the Daughters of Albion, he does have a role in the marriage of heaven and hell. However, in the Four Zoas, by contrast, Satan, and I would like to point out all the variants thereof, appear 43 times. And although Jean H. Hagstrom argues that in the Great Prophecies, the Four Zoas, Milton and Jerusalem, Satan has replaced Urizen as the arch villain and the anti-man, that, I think, is not entirely correct either. Blake has not replaced Urizen with Satan, but rather has revealed to his audience that Urizen is Satan. Here I am, of course, stating nothing new. But it is in the Four Zoas that Blake realises that he will have to, at last, explicitly state this to his readers. They just haven't got it. The best example of this comes in Night the Eighth, in which the line, "The Lamb of God stood before Satan opposite," initially began, "The Lamb of God stood before Urizen opposite," which Pierce argues illustrates Blake's late sense of interchangeability between Urizen and Satan. However, I would argue that it's not such a late sense of interchangeability that causes this transformation, but rather a late sense of recognition that his readers are not seeing the connections between Urizen and Satan that Blake has been implying throughout all of his poetical works, that Urizen is the centre of Blake's cycle. So Northrop Frye's Fearful Symmetry, which, as you know, is published in 1947, forms the basis of much of the later Blakean scholarship, and his ideas about Blake, whether correct or not, often frame the narrative of Blake research, the most notable of which has been his observations regarding the Orc cycle. I have, for ease, put some on the screen for you. So the Orc cycle begins and ends with Orc, with Urizen taking the middle role of mediocrity and reason. At its simplest, the Orc cycle sees the rise of revolution or imaginative power, i.e. Orc, which then succumbs to reckless tyranny and empire, that is Urizen, before we see this in turn condemned and destroyed by the rise of revolution, Orc. However, by doing so, revolution itself becomes the very tyranny that it seeks to eradicate. The Orc cycle is an unbroken chain of human history in which the repressed overthrow their tyrants and then become the repressors of the next cycle. The Orc cycle has become a common trope in Blakean studies, a way of expressing overarching themes that may or may not run throughout Blake's mythological process and poetry. However, this overused cliché, if you like, has not been without criticism. Most famously, Hobson, who argued against the Orc cycle as ever having existed in The Myth of Blake's Orc Cycle. My argument is different to Hobson's in that I do think that there is a cycle, but that it's Urizen and not Orc who's the central figure. But if you like, it's not a historical cycle like the Orc cycle, but rather a spiritual one. So after the Four Zoas, Orc sort of disappears into the background of Blake's mythological structure, not so much rejected as reassessed in terms of importance, with very few references made and even fewer spoken lines. As such, Orc's importance as the opposition to Urizenic tyranny through righteous rebellion, as demonstrated most profoundly in the Lambeth prophecies, radically changes in the Four Zoas. Whilst the earlier nights correspond with the tale of Orc, Loth and Enetharmion from the Lambeth poems, the later nights see Urizen and Orc not as contradictions to one another, but rather as two parts of the same whole, and this is most clearly shown through the two versions of the seventh, which I'll come to in a minute, although this is much this is earlier. This is also obvious much earlier in the mirrored poses in plates 10 and 12 of America, which I have put on the screen for you. They both, Orc and Urizen, both pose in the same way. So it's common to call the different versions of Night the Seventh 7A or 7B, and yet I'd argue that these versions might be better understood if we called them the Urizen and Orc versions, due to the oppositional struggle that these two characters have in both versions of the Night, in which a conflict of dominance is portrayed and, guess what, no real winner shown. It would be easy to suggest that Blake was not sure how he wanted this confrontation between an Orc and Urizen to culminate, and thus could have written two different versions to deal with this. I'm not sure. So, Night the Seventh, or Knights the Seventh, is a difficult concept to understand, even for people who, like me, who focus predominantly on the four zoids. It's just so confusing, especially when you use Erdmann's edition. So, so the two versions of Night the Seventh have, as Pierce states, troubled scholars intensely since the first editorial work on the poem began, which I think is quite curious given the lack of trouble some scholars seem to have over the differences in the first book of Urizen and the various different plates, but that's my own opinion. So the placement of the two Knights the Seventh is something that each editor or scholar who's going to look at the four Zoas must decide upon as to how it fits into their overall argument. So for the sake of time here, I'm not going to go into the different ways that scholars have placed A and B. There are a lot. But I would suggest for my reading that Donald Alt is perhaps the closest when he argues that Knights, the A, 7A and B function as alternative routes of realization of the same events, insisting that they are not different versions of how the same events occur, but are different ways in which they actually do occur. So if we combine this idea with Pierce and Hobson's ideas that the two parts are, quote, understood as representing two alternative possibilities rather than a substitution of one version of the other, and that each set of characters exists as a synoptic extension of the others, that is, that they exist independently of each other and yet are intimately connected, then I would argue that Blake is indeed trying to find alternative versions of the same Night the Seventh. This is best shown through a reading of Night the Seventh A as the Urizen version and Night the Seventh B as the Orc version. So in each version, there are events that occur in both with slightly similar or slightly different consequences. However, if we engage with this idea that Blake is relegating Orc, we must understand that the purpose of Night the Seventh A, in light of the post-7B changes, is not to substitute 7B per se, but rather to act as a way of substituting Orc with Urizen. So the fact that Blake kept both versions suggests not a substitution or alternative possibilities, but an examination of Orc and Urizen, and an acknowledgement of the changing role that Orc was to take in the later poems. So therefore, Night the Seventh in both versions shows the development of Blake's ideas regarding the importance of Orc, but is also an example of how he's trying to incorporate these changes into a poem that's already being written, as his characters are becoming increasingly malleable and they're becoming harder to control in their existing forms. So for the next section, I'm going to move away from the Erdmann edition of Blake. I know, shocking. And instead rely on Keynes, which is something I very rarely do, because he presents Knights, the 7A and B, one after one another, and it allows me to compare them in a way that I can't use in the amalgamated Erdmann edition. So if we accept, and I'm not saying that you have to, that Night the 7th A is the Urizen version and Night the 7th B is the Orc version, and that 7A had many later changes, most especially the change of Loss's character and its development and his development into the loss of Milton and Jerusalem, which is not something I have made up, it is something lots of scholars say. It's easy to see that Blake saw this version as the final, or at least the more rounded version of Night the Seventh. This is for a number of reasons, the most prominent being that Orc only talks in Night the Seventh A, and that the confrontation in 7A is actually between Orc and Urizen. But this same argument also suggests that 7b, where orc does not speak at all, holds no real place in the Blakean canon, at least from the Urizen orc perspective. And this does a disservice to the importance of 7b in creating the changes to 7a and vice versa. So Alt suggests that though Urizen virtually drops out of an active role after Night the 7th A, in Night the 7th A, after Enetharmon's shadow is drawn down, he is the hidden topic of the entire night. The Orc-Urizen confrontation opens the night, and though they perceive each other as separate entities, indeed opposite beings, their speeches and their narrative proper disclose them to be aspects of each other. So this argument is valuable to our understanding of the importance of 7b, as it clearly demonstrates how the confrontation between Orc and Urizen is at the centre of the entire night, and that Urizen is the hidden topic or underlying key to both Nights the 7th. Although Urizen is hidden in 7b, the shadowy female takes on the role of temptation that he performed in 7a. Orc's recognition that the arts of Urizen were pity and meek affection, which the shadowy female alludes to as a Urizen's harlot, keep the reader aware that Urizen is once again the reason for Orc's transformation into his serpent form. So, I shall briefly discuss Night 7b before moving on to 7a. Whilst I argue that Night 7b is the Orc version, as I said earlier, it's also the version in which Orc has no spoken lines. But this is furthermore proof that it's Urizen and not Orc that is the centre of the Urizen cycle, for without Urizen being there specifically to talk to Orc, Orc is unable to move beyond his howlings that we hear throughout Nights the 5th and 6th and be able to speak words. Although I do not agree with Hobson that there's no cycle, his explanation that the serpent imagery throughout Blake's works is connected not to Orc, as many argue, but to Urizen, explains so many of the satanic links to Urizen. This helps to show the importance of Night the 7th B in how Urizen is able to create a chain reaction, if you like, of Urizenic dominance in the poem, and in this night particularly. When discussing Night the 7th B in regard to Hobson's succinct and highly important point that the serpent temple and the snake design are emblems of Urizen's power, we need to start with Orc's recognition of the shadowy vortex as Vela now become Urizen's harlot, and therefore Orc's earlier characterization of Luva in Night the 2nd, most especially his lament in the furnaces of Urizen, the only time this turns up, by the way, the furnaces of Urizen, needs to be read in greater detail. Thus, Luva explains his relationship with Vala. Vela. When I called forth the earthworm from the cold and dark obscure, I nurtured her, I fed her with my rains and dews. She grew a scaled serpent, yet I fed her though she hated me. Day after day she fed upon the mountains in Luva's sight. I brought her through the wilderness, a dry and thirsty land, and I commanded springs to rise for her in the dark black desert, till she became a dragon-winged, bright and poisonous. While we are told that Vela forgot he was her Luva, here we can see that the Urizenic power has been with Vela from the very beginning. Although Vela is described as a scaled serpent in line 9, which is a direct connection with Urizen, if we take Hobson's view, her starting as an earthworm before taking snake form and finally becoming a dragon-winged bright suggests that Urizen's dominance over Vela develops over time. This is most especially relevant as Vela and Urizen are the only characters in the Four Zoas described as turning into dragon form. Here in Night the 2nd is the beginning of what might be considered a Urizen cycle within the confines of the Four Zoas rather than Blake's overall mythological structure. We see Vela taking on Urizenic characteristics, which in turn causes Luva to transform into Orc when he states that I was love but hatred awakes in me. So Orc in turn, we're returning back to Night the 7th B, by the way, is tempted by the shadowy female who was once Vela, and thus Orc takes on Urizenic form when his human form consumed in his own fires, and he becomes a serpent. No more of Orc, but the serpent. The form of Orc was gone. He reared his serpent bulk among the stars of Urizen in power. The serpent shape that Orc takes here does more than simply transform him out of human form. Blake's use of "no more remained of Orc" suggests the total destruction of Orc, one made even more clear by Blake's use of parallelism to repeat himself in different words. The form of Orc was gone. Here, Orc is under the complete control of the Eurozenic world, and by taking shape as a serpent, he has put himself in that position. Urizen has, indirectly, been able to control and destroy Orc, or what makes Orc, Orc. Whilst Hobson argues that one reason the Orc cycle does not exist is because Orc is, quote, never described as growing old or dying, or as aging into Urizen, nor is Urizen ever described as an older Orc. Here, we can clearly see Orc taking on a different type of Eurozenic description. Orc may never be described as aging into or becoming Urizen, but his transformation into a serpent in Night 7b suggests that Blake recognises that Orc is a part of Urizen. Furthermore, I would argue that Urizen does not need direct contact with other characters to make them part of his Urizen cycle. Even as Urizen is directly connected with Orc in 7a, he need only tempt and change Veiler, who then does the same to Orc in Night the 7th B. Urizen is the cause, but he does not necessarily have to be the causation of Orc's Urizenic transformation in Night the 7th B. In this way, the Urizen cycle, unlike the Orc cycle, is not dependent on Urizen's link with the characters, but instead he acts as a catalyst or a starting point. So the role of Urizen in Night the 7th A, which as you'll remember is the Urizen version, by comparison, places him in direct confrontation with Orc. In this version, it is the development of Urizen's character which Blake is examining, as compared to the changes to Orcs. As such, both versions of Night the 7th remain separate but equally important. Unlike the temptation of Orc by the shadowy female through woman's arts, great, thank you, Blake, for that fantastic quote. In Night the 7th B, Urizen himself converses and tempts Orc in a manner eerily familiar to the conversation between Satan and Eve in Book 9 of Paradise Lost. Again, I'm not really saying anything new here. At least it starts that way, but it quickly becomes apparent that Urizen Satan has become embroiled in a temptation with a higher power. The start of Urizen's temptation begins, like Satan's, with him working on Orc's vanity and pride, although from a very different direction than the one Satan takes with Eve. Urizen chooses that of pity. Urizen's words to Orc thus begin: "Image of dread, whence thou art, whence is thou most woeful place, whence these fierce fires but from thyself? No other living things in all this chasm I behold, no other living thing dare thy most terrible wrath abide. Pity for thee moved me to break my dark and long repose, and to reveal myself before thee in a form of wisdom, yet thou dost laugh at all these tortures and this horrible place, or is thy joy founded on the torments which others bear for thee?" Here, Urizen is trying to understand how Orc works as a character, but ultimately he's actually trying to determine Orc's weaknesses and therefore be able to have control over him. By asking such questions and implying that Orc is stronger than others due to his ability to survive in such an environment, Urizen is creating a speech in which Orc cannot fail to answer. However, unlike Eve in Paradise Lost, who ultimately succumbs to Urizen's flattering, Orc rejects Urizen's pity and instead responds with questions for Urizen, even making reference to him as a cold, grovelling demon of woe, suggesting that he's aware that Urizen is not truly of pity, but of woe. Furthermore, in Orc's repetition about his physical state of being nailed, he is condemning Urizen as being blind to the world outside his own view. And this is made even more cutting when Orc uses the phrase "for lo" twice. He's telling Urizen to look at me, and not ask such stupidly obvious questions. But it's the part 2 speeches later that's most important. So In this speech, Orc reveals that he's aware of Urizen's identity by naming him. Orc's ongoing descriptions of Urizen. Sorry, I have lost my PowerPoint.
Sorry, Annise, I don't know why it dropped out.
It's all right. I shall start from the right. Where were we up to?
We were on slide 17.
17. Brilliant. Here we go. Here we go. From current slide. Can you see this?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Brilliant. Sorry about that. So Orc's ongoing descriptions of Urizen as hoary and cold grovelling demon of woe are clear indications that he's already aware of with whom he is conversing. But he is not explicit until his proclamation that "Thou knowest me now, O Urizen, Prince of Light, and I know thee. Is this the triumph, this the godlike state that lies beyond the bounds of science in grey obscure?" In these lines, Urizen's self-made godhood is called into question by Orc. Because of that, Urizen is terrified, now certain that he, that is Orc, was Luva, demonstrates this even further. Urizen is unsure of his own status as God from eternity to eternity, and therefore he made Orc in serpent form compelled, stretch out and up the mysterious tree. So he forces Orc to follow his commands and take on the shape that is Urizenic, that of the serpent. And by doing so, Urizen reinforces his own power over Orc, his own identity, and thus shows the dominance of the Urizen cycle. So connections between Urizen and Satan cannot be overstated. I don't know why I'm telling you this. You all know this. And have been the foundation of much Blakean scholarship. But I would argue that it's important that we recognise that for Blake, Urizen is Satan, and that he always has been. So Jean Moskal would disagree, stating that despite the curious statement in the Bard's song that Satan is Urizen, the villains Urizen and Satan imply fundamentally different views of the nature of human offence, as error or as genuine evil. Blake's use of both villains in the Four Zoas and Milton suggests a desire to combine the two to preserve the earlier benign view in the face of an increasing shift of conviction towards the more sinister view. In Jerusalem, Urizen, for all practical purposes, disappears. So, for Moskal, Urizen and Satan are fundamentally different, and thus represent different things, but that in Milton and the Four Zoas, Blake tried to incorporate the two characters together unsuccessfully, and thus Urizen is removed from Jerusalem. So Moskal's overall points are correct, I would argue, but it's not that Urizen and Satan are fundamentally different, it is that they are fundamentally the same. Blake uses them interchangeably in the Four Zoas, and it's only in Milton, in that, quote, curious statement, that he explicitly states what he has always known, that Urizen is Satan. Furthermore, this can be seen throughout the whole of Blake's mythological poetry, starting with Urizen's first official, if you like, introduction in Visions of the Daughters of Albion, where he is, "O Urizen, creator of men, mistaken demon of heaven." Here, the connotations to Satan are easily recognizable. Blake is not contrasting Urizen to Satan here, but is presenting a reflection through which the reader can see that Urizen is Satan. So, back to the Four Zoas. With the relegation of Orc, it becomes clear that Fry's Orc cycle is unstable, but not completely incorrect. It's Urizen and not Orc that is the center of this cycle. So for Urizen, for Blake, Urizen is the constant, the one character that never changes, that always represents Satan or the god of this world, the adversary. So he's also the one character that Blake never stops working on, for even on his deathbed. It's the Ancient of Days. There we go, the Ancient of Days, there we go. it's the Ancient of Days, or Urizen, that Blake is redesigning. That is because Urizen is the center of Blake's mythological world building. He's the adversary, Satan, the one whom Blake doggedly tries to warn his readers about throughout his poetry. It's Urizen that people have been worshipping. That is Satan, and this is something that Blake constantly struggles to try and explain to his audience. Although it takes until Milton for Blake to explicitly state that Satan is Urizen, it's clear that he is the mistaken demon of heaven. In the visions of Daughters of Albion, that Blake is diligently trying to expose the truth. So through the Urizen cycle, we can see that Orc is a part of Urizen, whether this is when he takes Urizenic form, or when Urizen and Orc, or when with Urizen and Orc poses in America a Prophecy, which I showed earlier, we can see that by being part of Urizen, Orc is also a part of Satan. So this is shown at the very beginning, right near the beginning in America, a Prophecy, when Orc is called blasphemous demon antichrist hater of dignities. And thus Urizen and Orc represent two different representations of Blake Satan, if you like. So Urizen stands in for the reasonable Satan, the convincer, whereas Orc stands in for Satan, the hero. So here we have two pictures. So one only has to consider two ways in which Blake visually presents Satan. So I've specifically chosen ones where he's done Satan from Milton. Okay, so thus Satan rousing his legions from Paradise Lost has the same heroic pose and youthfulness that Orc takes in America, whereas the old man of the third temptation from Paradise Regained is presented as a Urizenic figure. That Blake can have both at the same time is not hard to imagine, for we only need to look at his illustrations to the Book of Job, that the god of the Book of Job is presented as Urizen and in the illustrations, and is more precisely the Satan, the father, the creator of the fallen world, whereas Satan is the more Orc-like, is Satan the Punisher, the Satan of Paradise Lost. So both characters are Satan. One is wearing Urizen, if you like, and the other Orc, or more precisely, both Satans are one Satan and they're both Urizen. So what is clear is that for Blake, Urizen has always been Satan. He just hasn't always been able to get people to understand it. So finally, the Urizen cycle then is ultimately an attempt by Blake to expose the nature of the god of this world, an attempt to show his audience that they have been worshipping Urizen Satan and not God. Whilst it's clear that Urizen was always Satan, and that the Urizen cycle was a way in which to warn his readers of the dangers of fixed religion, it appears that Blake's audience just didn't seem to grasp it. The Four Zoas then demonstrates that for Blake, the god of this world is Urizen, Satan, and he needed to make his people understand, make people understand that this character is God the terrible destroyer and not God the saver, and thus the cyclonic Urizen cycle is a way to do so. Thank you.
Annise, thank you for a very thorough and detailed dive, as people like to say these days, a deep dive into the extraordinary sea of symbolism and semantics that is Vela or the Four Zoas. Am I right in thinking that Urizen, to some extent, in the major prophecies, disappears and Satan takes his place?
Yeah.
They're part and parcel. Urizen's much prominent.
Yeah. So he sort of, yeah, he does disappear, but not in the same way that Los or say Tharmos does. So, and I think that he doesn't. Yeah, maybe in the poetry he disappears, but Blake is always working on him in art, and I think a lot of people just kind to just completely ignore that. So he's working on a copy of The Ancient of Days on his deathbed. So he's obviously thinking of Urizen, even if he's not writing about him. So I think, yeah, I don't really have much on Milton and Jerusalem yet, because obviously the 4 hours is my thing. And I've had a little bit of a break from Blake for a minute. But it's something I want to look at, his earlier stuff, from poetical sketches all the way up to um right till his death. So
Fantastic. Yeah. Urizen is such a sort of potent figure, isn't he? He ends up on the Dome of St. Paul's, which is an interesting effect, isn't it? Given what he does symbolize.
yeah, no, I thought that was, I don't think they meant to, but for
No,
me
no.
it was like the world's best joke.
It's perhaps appropriate in more ways than they realized. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, shall we invite questions and responses and comments? We've got some very nice things going on in the chat. Yeah, lots of wonderful talk. Extraordinary. Is or will this be published somewhere? Will the talk be published somewhere?
So I'm having a bit of a break after my PhD, but hopefully, because it's mainly taken from my thesis, it dives into much more detail in my thesis. It's about 3 times as long. But yes, hopefully that will be a monograph at some point. But other than that, no, you're pretty much the first people other than Jason and Sibylla and a couple of my friends who have heard about the Urizen cycle, and most people's eyes glaze over. It's so nice to talk to people who don't. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've been desperate to read it, to hear it. There will be a recording, of course, which will follow of this exact talk. That's
Yes, and
wonderful.
if I suddenly realized I hadn't put any of my references on, so if anyone wants like the sources from where I got my references, just ask. I've realized I forgot. So,
Uh, that's great. There's a question in the chat.
mm-hmm,
If Joe Safdie would like
mm-hmm.
to hear and ask their question, or whether we ask it for them. Joe says, I wonder if Professor Rogers is, you've been promoted,
I've been
quite rightly
promoted.
too. I wonder if Professor Rogers is familiar with the work of Catherine S. Freeman on the Four Zones, who argues that Blake's achievement by night 9 of that work is an achievement of non-dualism. How does Urizen figure into that?
Yes, I have read that. I was trying to stay away from ideas of dualism and non-dualism, because it's very easy to fall into the Blake idea of contraries, good and evil, God and Satan, and that's sort of just, I don't know. It's never really appealed to me. I also try to stay away from night the ninth, which it's the one night that everyone writes on. It's the one night everyone, other than what is the price of experience, it's the one night everyone talks about, as if like it sits on its own. So I think that's predominantly why I focused on night the seventh, because it's so weird. But I'm sorry, I'm just going to zoom up so I can read this again. Yeah, this idea of non-dualism is, I think, is very important, but because you so my thesis also examines like Jewish biblical poetical forms and how they react with this. So it it's kind of not my area. I'm more of like a typological reading. So I wouldn't want to try and fit Urizen into that without rereading it again. So it's a great question. Unfortunately, I can't answer it. Sorry.
No, fair enough. I should have invited everyone to turn their cameras on. Some have already. And Gareth Sturdy was first to have a raised hand. So perhaps we can go to Gareth.
Gosh, a raised hand. Annise, I remember the first time I ever spoke to you, which was in a pub after a Blake Society event, and I remember you just saying, "Well, I'm working on a thesis," and it is so wonderful to see it, take flight, and what a set of ideas. I mean, just amazing. But I was struggling to keep up because the ideas were just flowing thick and fast, and my brain is is not as good as yours. But as it happens, I am listening to this while I'm reading. I don't know if you're familiar with it, the God of the Left Hemisphere by Roderick Tweedy, which is, as the name suggests, all about Urizen and the centrality of him to Blake. And so what that book is looking at is kind of an Ian McGilchrist sort of take, a sort of Blake through the eyes of brain lateralization, which I know is not what you're concerning yourself with here. But I was just struck, I don't know if this is a question or not really, but I'm really struck by this idea that you've brought out in Night 7 of Orc and Urizen being two approaches to the same thing, the same thing done in two separate ways, which, if nothing else, fits so neatly with this argument of two ways of attending to the world in terms of consciousness. And I mean, whether you intended it or not, I think you've just lodged a great big grenade in there for the brain lateralization thesis for Blake, because it just transforms the whole way that I now, think of Blake, which is absolutely wonderful. So I suppose I'm just going to ask you, do you have any truck with this brain lateralization idea that Blake was sort of onto something well ahead of the neuroscientists, or am I just barking up the wrong tree there?
I would say, one, neuroscience and brain lateralization, it's not my strong point. I think that he is seeing the world as not black and white. And for instance, and I'm not the person that came up with this, so this other critic did. People often write about Orc as if this is this amazing heroic character, and the first thing he does is rape someone. The first time you met him, he rents somebody. And he does these horrific acts, but that's okay because he's a good character, so we forgive him. In the same way that is what happens with Los until Milton and Jerusalem. Los in the Four Zoas, other than in Night the Seventh A, is awful. He's like a villain. And so I think that for I don't even know if I'm answering your question here, but it's more of a kind of Blake seeing the world as sort of more than just this is how I look at it, this is how other people look at it. He wants to look at it through everybody's eyes all at once, and he just can't quite grasp it. Like like everyone else can't understand his fourfoldness, really. We all pretend we can, but it's a bit like reading Derrida. We all pretend we can, and none of us can. But it's that kind of, he's trying to do it, and he's not quite grasping it. And I think with Orc and Urizen, it's especially in Night the Seventh, it's him trying to do that and ultimately failing. So he just sort of like moves into different characters. And I think that's why later he sticks with Satan, simply because he thinks people will understand if I say Satan rather than Urizen. But I don't think I answered your question. Sorry.
Well, no, I mean it's all really helpful. It just provides, for my mind, at any rate, just a much better rationale for why the Four Zoas ultimately doesn't go anywhere, and the whole thing then sort of changes, goes through a bit of a kaleidoscope. I think it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's been a while since we've had someone that's just come in like you and kind of kicked the tables over and gone, no, let's just reconsider a whole load of stuff, properly scholarly work. It's amazing. So congratulations, I think is absolutely brilliant. Thank you.
Hi, Gareth. We now have Barbara Vellicott has had her hand up.
Thank you very much. I found it very interesting to hear you just track Urizen through. But on the question of dualism and non-dualism, I think we have to note the fact that right at the end of Jerusalem, Urizen is glorious. And I find that really inspiring, that last great panorama in Jerusalem where everything appears in one unified vision. So I would suggest that we need both dualism and unity, which is a classic philosophical question. And years ago, I heard Ian McGilchrist talk about Blake in London. And I must say, I found it, because he would say that you need both. And I found that pretty convincing. But what really convinces me of the need for the unity as well as the dualism and the without contraries, there's no progression and so on, is that last panorama in Jerusalem. Thank you.
No problem. That's a great comment. Thank you. I'm not entirely sure how to respond to it because I love the last bit of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is really not my strong point. I think so. I've sort of stayed away from Night the Ninth, but I'm gonna talk about Night the Ninth a little bit here, because Night the Ninth is sort of sometimes seen as the first version of the end of Jerusalem, which I think is wrong. And it also has a glorious Urizen, but a Urizen that is forced to be glorious. So Albion is sort of like the villain of the Four Zoas, which is strange, and he forces Urizen young. So he takes away his identity, and makes him this glorious, fantastic Urizen. But in doing so, destroys who he is. So he sort of becomes the Urizenic character. So yeah, no, I'm not sure that I actually am answering anything there. I just have always wanted to say that. But it's kind of, I think at that point he's working on this idea of breaking away from dualism and trying to find a unity, which I think he probably does get. I think for me, the end of Milton is, I think, stronger than the end of Jerusalem. Although I think it's how he defines this idea of evil being in everybody, which I think is why he makes Urizen glorious at the end of Jerusalem. But I do have some. It's just this idea, like, because I focus on the Four Zoas and it's sort of like the mixing pot, the melting pot where he's trying everything out. Quite often it's the opposite of what happens everywhere else, and I'm never quite sure which one he likes more. So I'm sorry, that didn't answer your question at all.
No, it's all right. I find it sort of intuitively absolutely okay that if Urizen is reason is one of the principles of the true human being, and exists alongside Los and Tharmas and Luva, and altogether they're glorious. Anyway, thank you.
No, thank you.
We have an interesting question from Douglas Hanson. Douglas, would you like to ask your question in person, or shall I relate it to Annise? Your choice. I think your camera's on, so we could spotlight you if you wish. Douglas, are you there?
Yes,
I'll ask.
I was hoping that that she could talk more about why Blake did not resolve or complete the Four Zoas.
Okay. So I read a fantastic article when I was doing my master's, which says that it's unfinished but complete, which is how I like to think of it. So it has an ending, it's complete, but it's unfinished. Basically, he changed his mind. That at the most basic, Blake's ideas of what poetry was, what anything was, he changed his mind. So in my thesis, I discuss it because he's in Haley's library. He reads all this fantastic critical stuff. He has these amazing discussions and is like, I don't actually know what I'm talking about. He goes from 1797-ish, being like, classics are great, Homer, I love him, to no, Homer and the Greeks destroyed everything. No, it's they're terrible. So it's this kind of and I mean, people think about the Four Zoas as like, oh yes, it's a bit like this, and he was writing it from approximately 1797 to around about 18. I usually go for about 1804, 1805, but everyone argues about different times. So it's like this huge amount of time where he doesn't publish anything else. He does a lot of art for other people and spends some time with Haley. So his ideas change, and what he and Night the Seventh is particularly useful for this. So Night the Seventh A has bits that were changed after he'd written Night the Seventh B, in which Loss's character, if you read Peter Otto's amazing book on the Four Zoas, exceptionally difficult, amazing though. He talks about this idea that Loss in Night the Seventh A suddenly becomes the Loss you see in Milton and Jerusalem, which is like this heroic, amazing, fantastic, knowledgeable character that you love, which is completely and utterly not the Loss you see in the Book of Loss or in the Book of Urizen or but so and I think that like Loss, like Orc, is often quite, people see him in quite like a static way, and all of the characters develop. And I think with the Four Zoes, it starts off as one thing. Blake then makes it something else, writes Night the Ninth, goes back to try and change it, and is like, I can't do it anymore. I'm not writing this poem anymore. It's not working for me. The first two nights are really classical in some parts, and they are really violent and gory and very kind of the Odyssey. Whereas his later nights, suddenly he's like, oh, I'm going to have Christ appear because I can't work out how to do it. In typical Greek tragedy things, I don't know what to do. I'll have God come down and sort it out. So Christ appears and is crucified, which is utterly fantastic, wonderful, and then just disappears off again. But I think he's trying so many different new things that basically he doesn't know what he's doing, and it changes so much that he's like, no, I need to write, this is more than I thought it was. I need to now write Milton and Jerusalem, because this isn't what it was and I can't make it that. And I mean, he really, really tries. If you look at the manuscript, he really, really tries. But he obviously loves it and he keeps it because we've got the fantastic one copy. But yeah, other than that, I can't really help. I keep changing my mind on why he's given up on it. But I think in the long term, it just does it. It's not doing what he wants it to do anymore. So he's like, I'll start something new. I'm not sure that answers your question.
Well, yes, it does. And if Fry called his chapter on this nightmare with her ninefold, and I guess I just am so surprised that something so fantastic just never really that he didn't get it out there at all to the world, and that he did make attempts to get these other Milton and Jerusalem out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably it's because obviously it's called Vela or the Judgment of. It's got so many titles. I usually call it the Four Zoas because it's nice and easy, but it started out as Vela, so like the Book of Ahania or something like that. He obviously thought it was one thing. It became the Four Zoas, and I think in the end he just didn't know what it was. So if he doesn't know what it is, how can anyone else understand it? And there are parts where he'll say one thing and then completely say the opposite in the next like page. So I think for him it became kind of like this, okay, I know which bits work and I know which bits don't, so I'll keep it. And he literally just like takes bits from it. There's bits of it and you're just like, yeah, that's redone in Milton or that's done in Jerusalem. So it's kind of, he does publish it, just not in the form that we look at it, if you like.
Thank you.
I've always felt that it starts halfway through a sentence, pretty much, doesn't it? Hearing the march of a long, resounding, strong, heroic verse, as you said, with a sort of classical feel to it. Because for me, because the the poem is so much about creativity and imagination. It's a series, isn't it, of creations, and they blend and they change and they metamorph as metamorphose as he's creating it. So it very much follows that process, but that process, in a sense, can't have an end. And so
Yeah.
where it is and does something else.
Yeah. So the best thing if you're looking at creations, destructions, and results, it's probably Night the Sixth, where he just keeps falling through all the different worlds created by different people, like the different Zoas, and then they're destroyed, and then he falls into the void again, and then it's a vortex, and he falls in, and after a while you're like, what world are you in? And you realize you don't know, he doesn't know, and probably Blake doesn't know either. And so he just then lands in Orthona's world. And it's just like Blake's gone, I don't know what I'm going to do next. Oh, Orthona, we haven't done that yet. Let's go there. A bit like when you get to the third in a horror movie sequence and they've got an underwater bit because they've never had it before. It's like Blake does that. It's like, we haven't had Orthona's world. We'll do that next. So yeah, it's this kind of very strange. There's lots of creation. There's lots of destruction. And I think the overwhelming thing is all the Zoas at one point want to be God, which is fantastic. Urizen honestly believes he is God, but they can create, they can destroy, but they can't recreate what they have destroyed. So when Urizen curses his sons and daughters, he cannot take that curse back. Not till Night the Ninth, which is like a reset button. It's a bit like being in the TARDIS and having a reset button. He can't take it back. He can't undo it. There's nothing that can take. He can't. If he was God, he'd be able to undo it. Loss destroys things. He chains Orc. He cannot then unchain him. So they can do things. They can have these amazing powers, but until something happens, they literally are just as stuck in the consequences of their actions. They're just their actions and consequences are a bit bigger than ours, I think.
Yeah, very true. Urizen thinks he's God, but he becomes subject to other forces continually, doesn't he? Yeah. Can I just ask, some authorities think that a lot of the poem was written in 1802, 1803, which would place it at the cottage in Feltham. Wonder what you felt about that.
So I read a lot about when bits were written, and I got into the habit of not caring. That sounds really horrible, but it becomes sort of like it becomes a vortex that you get stuck in and drown. You can drown in this vortex of when bits were written, when bits weren't, when bits were added, which bits were doing this, which bits were doing that. So I've always had the thing, from what I've read, that the first two nights were written probably pre 1797, simply because they have the original parts of the nights. They also have the drawings. He's going to illuminate them. He's going to do all these other things. The other parts are written on scraps of paper, the back or the front of Night Thoughts, whatever he's got his hands on. And I think the problem I have is we can't decide when all the changes were made or which bits were written when. I mean, we know that Night the Ninth was finished before he did some of the other nights, or at least was partly finished. He seems quite happy with Night the Ninth. If you read it, it's quite coherent compared to the rest of it. Disturbing, but incoherent. But I think that we get overwhelmed with these kind of, I don't want to say pernickety little details, but sometimes we have to just accept that he's changed his mind, and it might have happened overnight. It might have happened over a longer period, and yeah, he probably wrote quite a lot of it, Felpham. And if you ever get the chance to read my thesis, you'll find out how much I love Haley, and how important I think Haley is to Blake. But I think that it's not just those things that change his view. The world, I think a lot of the time we look at authors, artists, people who inspire us, and especially if they're dead, and we see them as like this fixed, static thing that they've always looked at the world in a certain way. you read Blake and you read stuff from poetical sketches, and it responds greatly. It's almost the same as things in Jerusalem. And then you read things from poetical sketches, and he never touches on them again. He completely and utterly disregards them. His own views change about things. So it's just, I mean, you only have to read the letter to Trusler in 1799, not good with Nate's, about Homer's amazing, he's great, he's as good as Milton, he's up there with the Old Testament, and then you get the Greeks and Romans are the reason of the death of art. So, and I think sometimes we get inundated with why they've changed their mind instead of they've changed their mind, or they've developed as a person. But that probably didn't answer your question either, Stephen. Sorry.
No, just interested to know what you thought about the dating. But I agree. I think the work is more important than anything else. There is a direct question's been sent to you, Annise, by Valerie Dalton. So I can't see what it is. Whether
Okay.
Val would like to put the question to you.
It might just be that Oh, I see. How much do you think that Urizen as Satan is characterized as a totally cynical being?
She's here. Valerie is here.
So, as a totally cynical being, that is a very, very good question. I don't think Urizen is completely cynical because Urizen has some, especially in the Full Zoas, he has some really funny lines. In the same, he's very much like Satan in Job a lot of the time, where it is the adversary, a Satan, a role, a representation of something. I think when Blake wants to be cynical about that kind of thing, he will use the devil because the devil and Satan for Blake are completely not the same. But the Urizen as Satan, I don't think he's totally cynical. I think he is the reasonable part of cynical, which is probably not a very strong answer, but he is. The problem I have with that is nothing is ever his fault, and nothing. It's always the fault of somebody else, and he is cynical to the point that he will see the world cynically. But if he sees the world cynically and then it doesn't fulfill his view, he will not be cynical. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
You've just said he sees the world cynically.
Yeah, so he will see the world in a cynical fashion, especially if he has created it, if it's his creation of the world. But if his worldview, so if how he views the world, if he's seeing a world cynically and then does not fulfill the view of the world that he believes the view of the world should be, he will be uncynical. Because he's a contrary like that. And he likes to just be what he is. And that's not a very good answer. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, but I'm glad you just mentioned the word contrary because you picked up on that earlier on. And surely the contraries are contrary mental states and emotional states rather than states of good and evil. They're contrary mental and emotional states.
Yes and no. In typical Blake fashion, he is everything and nothing at once. So yes, they're different and emotional states and mental states. But especially with some characters, I'm not entirely sure how. So, for instance, in the Four Zoas, and this sounds really simple. In the Four Zoas, Urizen will take the south. Urizen comes from the south in the Four Zoas. But in the book of Urizen, he comes from the north. Now, my good friend Sharon argues why he comes from the north in connection to Odin and various other points. And I discuss why loss comes from the north in the Four Zoas in terms of biblical reasoning and various other ideas about prophecy. The problem is we're both right and we're both wrong. And with contraries, especially Blakean ones, they don't have to be either or both at the same time. And that's just something I had to accept when I was reading Blake. And especially like reading Blake from an academic perspective, I couldn't deal with emotions, mental states, and all the various. I had to just have these kind of binary oppositions, these terms, because otherwise it becomes so complicated to be able to deal with it. But yeah, in terms of emotions and mental states, there are contraries, but the contraries are usually the emanations of the Zoas rather than other Zoas. So when Luva becomes Orc, he is love but hatred awakes in me. He can no longer be Luva. He has to be Orc. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question, and I'm really sorry.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you say, but surely the paradox, you have to hold the paradox.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, the contrary is a paradox.
I don't think of contraries as paradoxes. I view them, and this is where I have problems because I come at it from a literary perspective. I view them as binary oppositions.
Ah, okay.
So, for me, contraries are one thing or another with no movement.
I see.
So, from a literary kind of academic perspective,
Yeah.
you have to view it in a certain way, otherwise it's impossible to move beyond it and you just get involved in linguistics in terms of different
Yeah.
and it's a bit more like when I'm talking to other people about Blake, I have to explain to them that Urizen is reason. Now, I don't believe that. I don't think that that is all he is, but without then having to explain everything else to them, I have to make that point. And it's kind of I've had to step aside from everything to just have, for me, contraries are binary oppositions, because otherwise everything I'm arguing becomes about 10 times more complicated. And I'd like to start on the lowest level possible and sort of build up. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, but to say Urizen is reason is fair enough.
No, that is, but I often say to them, like, for the sake of this argument, Urizen is representing just reason, which I would never say to another Blake person.
No.
Ben,
Okay, thank you so much.
Sorry, that was a very complicated answer.
Ben Hackney has his hand up. He's been very.
Well, I can't resist commenting that without contraries, there's no progression. So I love the contraries. I am such an amateur. I never knew there was two versions of Night 7 and 8. I read mostly my reading online and on Kindle, and the Wikisource and Arizona State have what I thought was complete texts of Vala. But do they have A or B? I don't know. I mean, what's the normal?
So, if you read like from the Blake Archive, and most scholars read the Erdmann edition, which is the best, if you like, the best, most rounded. But he amalgamates Night the Seventh A and Night the Seventh B together and makes it one continuous night.
Yeah, that's what I've seen.
Yeah,
I didn't know there was a distinction.
No, so when you read it, you'll notice it'll say like portion 2, page 14, or portion A, portion 1, and it will be moved. And it's very complicated to read when you're trying to make a comparison. So I had to jump backwards and go to the previously accepted academic version, the complete, which was by Keynes, in which he splits it into A and B. So lots of some people will put B before A. Erdmann, I think, does A, B, B, A. Some people will put B, B, A, A. Literally they will put it in whatever order works for them. And that's one of the problems when you read a book about the four Zoas, is one of the first things you need to work out is what order they've put Night the Seventh in. Because it will, have they put it linearly? Have they put it in chronological order? Have they done it thematically? Have they done it alphabetically? Whatever. There's so many, because there's so many different ways to do it. And then you have the thing that Erdmann has also included absolutely all the deletions and all the alternative ways to do things, which Keynes does not. Sometimes he puts them in the footnotes, and you're like, did Blake want you to read that? He rubbed it out later. Did he rub it out? Did the Victorians rub it out afterwards, like they did with the art? And you've just got this kind of, I don't know what's going on. So on a whole, I do like to look at the manuscript and work with it. It is awful. And most of it is written in Blake's actual hand rather than his nice, easy to read writing hand. So a lot of the time I'm just like, no. Or he has lines, so he has bits written on the side and lines down and round, and then like X's and little. Some of the pages you just can't see.
So
Everything is just
A and B are on the same page in the manuscript.
yes, ish. So he'll add bits in, but it might be on
Okay.
with like. Do you know how when you're writing something and you star it and then you put it in?
Yeah.
He'll
Yeah.
have done that. So you
So,
it's
so there's no such thing as an A version and then separately a B version.
not really.
Okay.
It's kind
So,
of like which bits he wrote at which time. And
okay.
parts of Night the Seventh A were written after Night the Seventh B, which makes it even more nicely complicated. But yeah, no, on a whole, I will use Erdmann. Most people will use Erdmann, but people tend to drop in and choose what they want when it's Night the Seventh.
I see Erdmann, and the one I'm looking at has indentations. Maybe that's how he distinguishes. Anyway, I'll have to look into that.
But yeah, no, it was something that even when I started the Four Hours, I just didn't even think about. And then
he has them both, though. Good.
Yeah, he has them both, but all were put together.
Thank you very much. Utterly fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pen. I put into the chat, if you're interested in seeing the original manuscript, the British Library website has the whole thing. And you can actually.
So does the Blake Archive.
Yeah, you can look at the whole manuscript there, can't you? With all its A's and B's. That's lovely. Excellent. Any more questions? Lots of lovely comments in the chat, Annise. Thank you so much.
Stephen, I don't see yours in the chat.
It's further up. It's just to tell you that it's the Blake Library. Sorry, the British Library, that the manuscript is there.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah, Nathan Birnbaum has a comment, which I think, Nathan, would you like to speak that one out loud for us? There he is. Hi there.
Dr. Rogers, thank you so much. And Stevens, nice to see you. Yeah, I was just mentioning that that the idea that this is sort of a creative field is a wonderful image, and how, but there's clearly a kind of illusory situation when you sit down to try to do exegesis, because it seems for all the world that Blake is trying to create a system, but but it's kind of an exploded system, and it's a very with so much unconscious eruption going on all over the place, which is part of the reason why we love it so much, of course, why it's so great. That whatever intentions he may have been sitting down with, things go much deeper, broader, and more layered than that. So I'm sure that exegesis of this kind of work will go on forever. Um, oh,
Yeah.
you agree, Dr. Rogers?
Yeah. So one of when I a long time ago when I met my PhD supervisor for the first time, when I was writing a very short essay on sublimity and decided that Blake was a really good place to start. And he told me to go and read some Blake that wasn't the Songs of Innocence and Experience. And I read the Book of Urizen and thought, this stuff is amazing. Why have I not read this before? I decided that I was going to write my master's thesis on Blake. Very stupidly, it was like nothing I'd ever done before. And I picked the Four Hours because I liked the title, not gonna lie. And I read it and I read what all these different people had said about the Four Hours. And I thought, there's not that much. Why are people not saying anything? Like, why are we people? And then I read some stuff on Milton and Jerusalem and various other, like the big names and all this kind of, and I just thought, how is it that we're still talking about this? This must be amazing. This must be something that like, and it was more of a, we're creating with Blake the world that he's created. So it's like every time I reread the Four Hours, I'm not recreating the world I've already read. I'm creating a new world of the Four Hours that I'm reading. And I just thought, well, I think that's what Blake's doing, except for the Four Hours is sort of falling apart because he's doing that and he's supposed to know what's happening and he doesn't. But yeah, I think I always think of him a bit like he's given you the keys to the bus. Here's the bus, but you need to work out what the petrol is. So it's this kind of code. I do think that like his system is both less complicated and more complicated than we think. So for instance, when I read the Four Zoas and the earlier stuff, because I come from a more religious background, I can find things that are connected biblically or are when I just know what a threshing floor is. I know what these words mean, a tabernacle. I don't have to go and search what these things are. But at the same time, his code is completely unbreakable, and I don't think we're meant to break it. He is trying to make us make our own code to understand what he's saying. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know even if I've answered your question, but
No, no, it's not really. It's more of a sort of a comment. And yes, and I think it's probably what you just said is probably true of Bach and Shakespeare, where the levels and the depth gets to be beyond what an individual can really do consciously at the table while they're writing or at the etching or whatever. All these things come into play, and so we're left to create the work every time we read it, which is what the greatest art does. So yeah, I'm absolutely. I envy you being able to spend your life on this.
Nathan, thank you. Really nice to see you again. And
Yes, yeah.
thank you for a wonderful talk. We've saved all the stuff in the chat because it's full of tributes to your scholarship. And rightly so. You certainly deserve it, Dr. Rogers. Just before we go, we got a program planned right through to July and all sorts of speakers to take us on beyond that. And so I hope we can welcome you all back for the next event, and the dates and details of that and events going forward will all be published shortly. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. And once again, thanks to Annise. And if you'd like to show your appreciation with some silent clapping like we do on Zoom. Mine's silent, even though I'm not muted. Takes quite a skill to do this. Then thank you, everybody. Fantastic. And good night. Have a good night.